In part 1 of this guide, I did a quick run through of configuring a domain with MailGun. Now in this video, I want to take a step back and go through and explain the purpose of each of the records we created. All of the details I'll cover in this video are also outlined in a note set, which you can find a link for in the video description below. Jumping in, let's talk about the first setting we had to make, which was the domain that we are actually configuring. As part of this process, MailGun recommended that we set this up via a subdomain. And the reason we do this is because when you use a subdomain, it separates your email sending reputation from your root domain. That way, if you experience any issues with email deliverability, in other words, if your emails start getting caught in your users' spam boxes, it's not going to affect your main domain's reputation. And reputation is a really important concept when it comes to email deliverability. We want receiving email servers to trust that emails coming from our domains and our servers are valid and wanted by our users. Otherwise, like I said, they'll either get put in a spam box or sometimes they won't be delivered at all. And one of the primary ways we establish trust is just having it such that when users receive our emails, they're not doing things like marking them as spam. And ideally, our users aren't going to do that, but occasionally they might. They might forget that they had signed up on our site, and then we send them an email, and then they're suddenly like, I don't recognize where this email is coming from. They might mark it as spam, and that could hurt our reputation. And if you get enough marks against you, it can start to affect your email deliverability, where receiving servers are saying, wait a second, some people are saying this is spam. We're going to start filtering it as spam. All right, and when that happens, we don't want that sort of tank in reputation to be associated with our root domain, because it could forever impact our abilities to send emails from that root domain. And that's one of the primary reasons why we're using a subdomain. It's just to separate the reputation of our email sending domain from our root domain. Another reason to use a subdomain is just logistical purposes. You're going to be creating a bunch of DNS records in your domain associated with email sending. And by associating that all with a subdomain, it helps you separate which of your records are just for your main site and the routing of your primary root domain versus which are email specific for this email specific subdomain. Now, it's important to highlight, and they have a note about this at the bottom, that even though you're configuring things with a subdomain, you're still going to be able to send emails from your root domain. In other words, when emails appear in your user's inbox, the from address can be listed as your root domain. All of this subdomain stuff is really for behind the scenes configurations, things that are going to be communicated amongst the email servers, not necessarily something that your user has to see. Now, as you recall, in part 1 of this video, the subdomain I used for my example was mail.myrootdomain, which was hesweb.xyz. And I'm not going to set it up again here because I've already set it up. So I'm just going to transition into the DNS settings we looked at in part 1. And that way we can go through each one and understand its role. All right, so the first two records we set up were DNS records for sending. And let's start there. What's a DNS record? Well, DNS stands for Domain Name System. And it's basically the overarching system that domains and domain providers operate on when it comes to the web. And the DNS system works with records, which are essentially configurations you can associate with your domain. For example, I'm going to go over to Namecheap where I have this particular domain configured to look at my DNS settings. And we can see there's different record types. For example, the A record is like the main record for a domain where you can indicate what underlying server should this domain route to. So in other words, when I go to this domain, hesweb.xyz, my A record is pointing to this IP address, which is the IP address of the underlying server. You'll also see things like CNAME records or canonical name records. These are used for configuring things like subdomains. And then the record type we started to work with MailGun was these text records, which you can think of as kind of miscellaneous records. It's a way to associate certain values with your domain. And the first text record they had us create was for a SPF value, where SPF is short for Sender Policy Framework. And SPFs are used to basically authenticate that some server has the right to send email on behalf of our domain, or in this case, on our subdomain. So what's going to happen is when a receiving server gets an email from us, they're going to see it's coming from the MailGun servers, but it's going to check for an SPF record for our domain, or in this case, our subdomain, that's going to verify, okay, yes, we said it's okay for MailGun to send emails on our behalf. And this is an important verification step because without it, you could have email spoofing, or you could have random servers just sending emails from domains that they don't have the authority to be sending from. Moving on, the next text record is for a domain key. And you can see the value for this is a unique signature that MailGun has generated for our subdomain. And what's going to happen is when MailGun sends emails on our behalf, as part of the metadata of that email, it's going to include a signature that ties into this signature. You can kind of think of a lock and a key system where this is a key that is custom built to go with a corresponding lock that's going to go with all of our outgoing emails. So what's going to happen is when receiving servers get our emails, they're going to look for this key in our DNS records, and they're going to check it against the unique signature or the lock that came with the email, and it's going to make sure it's a match. And just like the SPF record, that's going to further validate the authenticity of the email, showing that it is coming from a verified server, and also that the message hasn't been altered in any way as part of that sending process. Moving on from sending records, there's a couple of receiving records you can set up. And this is especially important if you are planning on receiving any email via the MailGun servers. And this is the sort of thing you would want to do if you wanted to, say, automate some process on your server in response to receiving emails from users. For example, let's say you're running a contest where users could submit a submission via email, and you wanted all of those submissions to be automatically processed on your server and, let's say, entered into a database. You could set this up with MailGun. You can configure basically a routing system where if it gets incoming email to a certain address on your domain or your subdomain, it could send a request to your server to process that email, and as part of it, it would send you the contents of that email. That's more of an edge case. The majority of people that are using mail services like MailGun are using it just for sending purposes, but there are definitely use cases for receiving. And if you want to get more into that, you can see there's a whole section in MailGun for configuring receiving. Now, even if you're not planning on receiving email, though, they do recommend you set up these MX records because it's another thing that just helps with email sending reputation. Because when the receiving servers are going through their verification process, deciding whether they should mark your email as spam or not, if they see, okay, not only have they granted authority for this particular server to send emails, they also have the authority to receive emails as just another check in the trust column. Now, a word of caution about this, though, is MX records are also used typically if, let's say, you're setting up your domain to receive email via a service like Gmail, you'll have MX records for that. So you want to be really careful when you're setting this up to not conflict with any existing records. And speaking to that, that's one of the reasons we set things up with the subdomain, is just to avoid any sort of conflicts with things like our MX records and our root domain. And finally, that brings us to the last record we had to add, which was a CNAME record, which is short for canonical name record. This is one way to configure subdomains. And in this case, we're actually configuring a subdomain of a subdomain, right? So this was the subdomain I set up for MailGun, and then they're prefixing that with another subdomain of email. And any traffic to this address is going to be routed to the MailGun servers. And where this is used is oftentimes when you're sending emails via MailGun, especially if you're doing things like newsletter sending, you want to collect certain statistics about what links your users are clicking in those emails, because you want to see, okay, what is grabbing their attention, what is getting them to engage. And MailGun can track all of that data. And the way they do it is they take any links in your outgoing email and they replace them with essentially an alias to this tracking subdomain that you're setting up. And that's going to route to the MailGun servers where they can record the data about which links are being clicked. And then ultimately they are forwarding then on to the original link so the user ends up at their destination. But in the process, they're collecting some really useful data that can be helpful as you're trying to figure out what is working and not working within your newsletters. Now, just a quick note about this, if you do want to have that data collected, in addition to setting up the CNAME record, you do have to go into your domain settings and make sure that click tracking is enabled for that redirect and collection process to happen. But I'm getting a little bit beyond the scope of this video, which was just to go through these DNS settings and understand what the role of each record is. because all too often we go through and we set things up really quickly without necessarily understanding what it's doing. And most of the time that's fine, but occasionally we might run into problems or we might have deliverability issues down the road. And understanding what these behind the scenes settings are doing can be helpful in troubleshooting those issues when they arise.